Well, thank you very much for having me here this morning. I appreciate it. I am friends with Scott Curry. Scott told me about a week ago, I was in the Ukraine. He said, "You're speaking at my men's breakfast next week." I said, "I am." I said, "That's great." I really appreciate this opportunity. Let me just put my glasses on here. I apologize. I literally did just return on Saturday night. So I didn't have a lot of time to prepare. I put a few notes down. What I wanted to talk about was a couple of things. A, how I got involved in Samaritans Purse. I want to talk about what the churches there in Ukraine are doing. They have really stepped up to the task of being a church, of what the church is all about. And I also wanted to talk about one of the lessons I've learned while I've been there. I'm not going to talk long. I'd much rather field your questions, help you understand maybe what's going on, how you can help, what's going on in the Ukraine, and especially to the churches there. So as Jay mentioned, I ran a software company, owned it for about 30 years. And then one day God said, "You've had enough of that. I've trained you. I've taught you. You've learned all the hard lessons I could throw at you. Now I need to use you to further my will." So, big change in my life. It was about 15 years ago. I was living in Boston. And I quickly realized that even if I had the best opportunity come on my doorstep tomorrow, I really couldn't take advantage of it. I owned a business. I had kids in college, owned a big house. So I spent the next 5 or 6 years just re-engineering my life. We sold everything, moved down to Florida where it's a lot cheaper to live, and did a lot of research. Samaritans Purse kept coming up. So I joined a division of Samaritans Purse called Disaster. It's called DART, and that stands for Disaster Assistance Relief Team. It's part of their disaster response unit. And basically, I am on call 24/7 to be ready to go anywhere within 24 hours in the world. So I've been doing that for about 5 years. I've been to some incredible places, seen some incredible things, been to Iraq, been to Syria, been to Lebanon. So I was out golfing in the villages about 2 months ago. I got a phone call and they said, "Hey, would you be interested in going to the Ukraine?" It was from Samaritans Purse. I said, "When do you want me to go?" He said, "Well, we need you to leave tomorrow." I said, "Okay. Can I finish my round?" They said, "Yeah, okay, that's all right. We'll let you do that." I said, "Where am I going to go?" They said, "You're going to go to Moldova." I said, "Moldova? Where in the world is Moldova? I thought this was Ukraine." I said, "No, you're going to Moldova." And I said, "Well, what's my role going to be?" And they said, "Oh, you're going to be the team lead." I said, "Oh, geez." I said, "I'm not asking any more questions." They said, "And by the way, what size do you wear? What size shirt do you wear?" I said, what do you need to know that for?" He said, "Well, we got to fit you for body armor." I said, "Oh boy." So next day I headed off to Moldova. And the two things I want to talk about, as I mentioned, are what the church is doing and what I've learned. I arrived in Moldova. It's a small country right on the border of Ukraine. At the time, approximately 300,000 refugees had left Ukraine, come to Moldova. Mostly women and children. Men are not allowed to leave Ukraine if you're between the ages of 18 and 60. You are required to stay in the country. So the challenge was Moldova is one of the poorest countries in Europe. It's a very small country, really does not have the resources to handle an influx of 325,000 people, all of whom basically had what they had on, could carry in a suitcase, if even that. Not a lot of money. So what Samaritans Purse does is we work through churches. So thanks to Operation Christmas Child, which I think many of you probably know, that's how most people know of Samaritans Purse. We distribute about 13 million shoeboxes to children, to underprivileged children around the world. In order to do that, we work through churches. So we have a network of tens of thousands of churches around the world. In any country you can imagine, we've got people that know us. We have instant credibility. So we, as a disaster relief unit, can literally walk into any country in the world, and there's people there that can help us with translators, with drivers. They can help us with places to stay anywhere. No other organization in the world has that. The Red Cross doesn't have that. No other NGO has that. So we came to Moldova. There are about 405 churches that are part of what's called the OCC network. So there are 405 churches that actually participate in distributing. They're not creating the boxes, they're distributing the boxes in Moldova. And we identified, I think it was 112 of those that had facilities where they could cook like you have here, where they could actually cook food so that they could then provide that food to both the refugees that were staying at their church, as well as the refugees that were staying at households in the community. In fact, I hired the head of the OCC to come work for us. So we were able to instantly, literally within a week, we were distributing 50 metric tons of food a week to these churches. We would distribute the food to the churches, and then the churches would invite in. Most of them had literally hundreds of people staying at the church on cots, on mattresses, anywhere they could. And we would distribute the food to distribution points. The churches would come, get the food, and bring it back. So it worked out well. We worked out an agreement with the largest grocer in Moldova. It's like a Costco, where we would actually put the order in. In fact, the first order we came to, they said, you want what? You want how much food? I said, we don't sell that much food in a month. I said, well, we need this food, and we're going to come back tomorrow. We're going to order more. And we're going to come back the day after that, and we're going to order more. So this company had to go and actually change their entire supply chain so that they could get enough food in so that we could supply the churches who were supporting these 300,000 refugees across the country. So every church I went to, when I talk about churches that stood up to the challenge, every church we went to was filled with cots. Every room had either food, clothing, medical supplies. These were Moldovans supporting refugees from another country. 90% of the refugees in Moldova are handled by churches, are supported by churches, are hosted by churches. We also worked with the government centers. The government centers that nobody wanted to go to the government centers. The refugees wanted to go to the churches. They were loved there. They felt like they were home. They were taken care of. So our role was to support the churches, because you can imagine this church with this entire gymnasium filled with 500-600 cots, with people being fed every day. The incredible strain that took on their resources. I had pastors come to me and say, I don't know how I'm going to pay the electric bill next month. There's just no way. I bought 2 tons of laundry detergent that we distributed to the churches. So we had 2 levels of distribution. We were supporting the people, the refugees, but we were also supporting the churches. We were paying their electric bills. We had, they could apply for appliances. They'd come and say, I can't serve 200 people with 1 microwave. You know, we're used to having a men's breakfast. We can do that. I can't feed 200 people every day. So we ended up supporting the churches. And that's really what we do in most countries. The churches are going to be there forever. They're the life and blood. We are there to make them the central focal point of that community. So we fund, when we go into any country, we typically work through churches. It strengthens them. They're the providers. So I was there for about 3 weeks in Moldova. It was so efficient. After 3 weeks, we had nationals running the entire program. So we hired people. We had about 15 national employees. They were running it. So I got a call from Samaritans first. They said, we need you up in Ukraine. We're having a lot of problems. Ukraine's a different story. A lot more people, a lot more problems. That's where the fighting is. So left Ukraine, left Moldova, went up to Ukraine, and I was completely blown away there by what the churches were doing. The churches were hiring buses to go and bring people to the border so that they could leave, the women and the children. They were acting as halfway houses for drivers. Drivers would come from the front driving people. They'd stop, they'd spend the night, they'd give their car to somebody else, they'd drive them to the border to drop them off. They'd stay at the church. The next driver would take them the rest of the way. They'd come back. They had this going 24/7 every day. Church, there'd be people on the border with on their phones. And they had a network of hundreds of people who said, I've got a room in my house. Okay. And so they say, I've got a family of 3 here, family of 5, 2 kids, 2 adults. And then they'd put them in touch with someone who had a house, who'd never met this family, never met this person, said, I've got a house or I've got an apartment that they can stay at my house. And then they'd have a driver that would drive them 3-4 hours away, let them stay at their house. They'd come back the next day. They were setting up soup kitchens. It was the most amazing demonstration of love and compassion of really what the church is designed to do, to be the hands and feet of Jesus. It was incredibly impressive. I was blown away. Every church I walked to, I went to a church. There was a gentleman who ran a metal fabrication plant. That was his business. They were making body armor for the soldiers at the church, in addition to feeding hundreds of people every day. It was incredibly impressive. And this was happening at every church I went to in the Ukraine. They were the ones, we were not allowed in the conflict zones. So I get a map every morning, showed me where in the country the conflict was. And we had a 50-kilometer buffer around that zone. I was not allowed to go in there. But we hired a lot, so we would send food to the churches. I bought 40 Sprinter vans just to deliver food. We would deliver food to the churches and the churches would take it in. These are the bravest guys I've ever met. Young men, older men. And they were the ones that actually brought it in the middle of the fighting, in the middle of the war zone. They were the ones that brought it in. So it quickly became our role. We had the money, we had the logistical support, was to provide basically a channel through which we brought food. We brought 900 metric tons of food every week. I don't know if you have any idea how much food that is. From all over Europe, we brought in what we call NFIs, non-food items. So hygiene kits, blankets, mattresses, Pampers, more diapers than you can even imagine. We had, we opened up 3 emergency field hospitals throughout Ukraine. We had what we call wash programs. So we were bringing in fresh water systems into these hard-hit areas. And again, we weren't allowed to go in, so we trained people to go in. And then the churches would go in and install them in bombed out water facilities. So they had the intake, but they didn't have the clean water. The Russians had bombed them. So our role quickly became, we were the way that we couldn't go into those areas, but we could supply the churches in the areas with the food, with the hygiene kits, with everything they needed to go in and support the hardest hit, those people that were still in those areas. So I think what most impressed me was just the way the churches stood up. You know, I often wonder if it were to happen here, how would my church react? You know, how would we react to? It was really a time when the church needed to be the church. They needed to be the hands and feet of Jesus, and they did. It was very, very impressive. The other thing I wanted to talk about is, and I mentioned this when I was leaving, you know, we had lots of challenges, incredible challenges in doing what we were doing. We had financial challenges. We had money, but we couldn't get, everything we had to do was pay with cash. So we're buying $40,000, $50,000 of food a day with cash, fuel, all with cash. We had challenges with fuel. They were running out of fuel. We had to go and buy 20,000 liters of fuel to put in reserve. We had to buy tanks to put the fuel in. We had to buy that from outside Ukraine, bring it in. We had to find food. We ended up creating programs where we were actually buying food from local farmers who now couldn't get their wheat and their grain out of the country because the ports in Odessa were being bombed and the Russians controlled the Black Sea. So we would actually buy the food from the farmers and then redistribute it to the people. So challenge after challenge after challenge. And what I realized is that I'd forget about the successes. I had 10 challenges yesterday and God solved one of them, but I'd focus on the challenges today instead of reminding myself of the success. And God did amazing, amazing things in the Ukraine. And I think in our own lives, we tend to focus on the challenges we face every day in our marriages, in our friendships, with our finances, whatever it might be. And we don't take a step back and look at what God's done to make our lives, all the blessings, the ways he's blessed us every single day. So by the time I left, we had, when I got there, we had one hospital. We weren't even distributing food. We hadn't distributed any water by the time I left. We had 3 hospitals. The challenges didn't go away. We had challenges every single day, nonstop challenges. And that's why we're there. But I look back and I realized, that God, despite those challenges, God did amazing things in the Ukraine. And I'm just reminded of the things that he does every day in our lives. So that's the message I had, but I'd love to answer any questions that people have about Ukraine, about Samaritan's Purse, about my experiences, anything like that. Who's that? Don't even recognize that name. Cool. Oh. Yeah, I did not, but I will also say that my role was mostly essential. Well, I traveled around the Ukraine to our bases, but I was not out in the field where distributing to the churches where it was likely I would have met them at that point. We did work with a lot of churches, so we may have been working with that group at some of those churches. It's highly likely. We had 3,200 churches that we were working through, all denominations, all types.
You already answered my question about the number of different denominations, Catholic, Protestant, and any others that they all stepped up. Well, that's
it was the response that I saw was across all denominations. You couldn't walk by a church or you walk into a church and not see that they were somehow contributing, mostly by housing what we call IDPs, internally displaced people, throughout Ukraine, and incredible sacrifices of the Ukrainian people.
I mean, that's a real message of hope that we would hope would be broadcast through the news networks of the faithfulness of the churches in stepping up. Why don't you send them a text or something?
Yeah. No, as I said, that was the most impressive thing to me, is that the government, even where the government, they tried. I mean, it wasn't like the government was ignoring the plight of the IDPs. But clearly when we would, and we actually provided mattresses, we provided hygiene kits to the government centers, but it was clearly in a completely different environment. There was not this sense of, I am being loved here, I am being supported here, both spiritually and physically. You didn't get that at the government centers. You got that at every church. You were invited to eat a meal with other, together as a group, and so it provided a platform where the churches could really, do what they're designed to do. They were able to provide hope and meet physical and spiritual needs. I had one pastor tell me that they had baptized 3 new members in the last year. In the last month, they baptized 18 new members. Because you have to realize these people had put their hope in a lot of things, a lot of material things, their jobs, their careers, their homes, and those things were gone. And so they're in a position where they're wondering what does really matter, and what do I base my life on, and what do I base my hopes on and my dreams on. It's either material things that can be taken away or can be destroyed, or it's on eternal things. And so it's probably one of the best things about doing the type of work that I do. Not that I like to see people that are hurting or whose homes have been destroyed, whose lives have been shattered, but it does open them up to a message of hope. And that's really what Samaritans First does. We're there to be the hands and feet of Jesus. We just happen to do it through humanitarian relief. There's lots of ways you can do that. Doesn't always have to be by doing humanitarian relief. It could be your neighbor next door. There's plenty of opportunities. The challenge is taking that step and doing it.
This is Ron from Nebraska on Zoom. And I just wondered, we hear on our media over here that sometimes the Russian soldiers they don't have their hearts into what they're doing. Did you get any sense of that sort of situation?
Honestly, you probably know more about that than I do. One of the things about being deployed is we are so laser focused on just getting the job done, completing the mission, that I honestly don't really get any chance to hear any of the news. I know what's happening in the areas that we serve, but and we as I said, we were prevented from going into those areas where the conflict areas where I might actually meet a Russian soldier. So we really were focusing, specifically our organization, me in particular, was really focusing on how do we, regardless of how the situation came about, the political reasoning behind it, and this is what we do anywhere we go. We do not take sides. If we were feeding Russian soldiers, if there were Russian soldiers in need, we would have met their needs as well, had we gone in there. And the church is the same way. And we do that everywhere we go. So we never take sides. We're completely independent. And so our goal is to be the hands and feet of Jesus, which is what Jesus would do. So we don't take sides. But no, in this case, typically we are more involved in the actual distribution of what we are providing, whether it's water, whether it's medical help, whether it's food. In this case, since we weren't allowed in the conflict areas, that was all done via the churches. The IDPs that we did come in contact with were the ones that were in the churches who had escaped the conflict areas. I will say that probably the toughest job at Samaritans First was the job that our translators did, because they did have to hear those stories a lot, especially in the medical facilities we had. Many of the people in those facilities came out of the conflict areas, a lot of battle injuries. And so they did hear some stories, and they had to hear it over and over and over again. So I always felt that the toughest job for anyone involved in our response was our translators. They were typically locals. And they did hear some stories that, yeah, and you could tell the times they didn't even want to repeat what they heard. So I know that it was tough, but I was not actually, I was never put in a position where I would see that or hear that directly.
Thank you.
I am not. Yeah. And that's one thing that that's one of the real benefits we have is being Samaritans first. We can walk into any country in the world and we have access to translators because of the church network. We have instant credibility. People know who we are. We go directly. So before we even land, we've already contacted the churches on the ground that we work through. In fact, I had a funny story. I was in a meeting one day and the team lead called me and he said, how many nationals are working for us? I said, well, I'm not sure. When do you need to know? He said, I need to know in 10 minutes. He said, Kenny Isaacs, who's our top VP, says he is presenting. What was it called? He's been called to when you go to Congress. He's testifying at Congress about the war in Ukraine, and he needs to know this in 10 minutes. I said, well, I don't know if I don't think I'll have that. I said, if I don't get back to you, I don't have that off the top of my head. If I don't get back to you, why don't you say 40? So that's a pretty good estimate. So I sent off a couple of texts and miraculously I got the numbers back within my 10-minute time frame, and we had 145. And it just goes to show you, again, when you're focusing on the challenges every day, you don't always see what God's done. And totally blew me away. I said, where did we get 145 national? Now we're probably over 500. So what we do when we go into a country is we provide support to the churches, and we keep as much money, and we hire as many locals as we can, because they're the ones that are going to stay. They're the ones that are, they're the ones that are with the people, helping them, serving them, supporting them. So we will end up having I'm sure we're going to have a country office. We'll be there for at least 2 years. We'll open up a country office. We'll probably hire 1,000 nationals, Ukrainians, and we'll be able to support that with maybe 10 or 15, what we call IFS, US or Canadian nationals. That's typically how we would work in a country.